everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this, our latest Rise 8 live broadcast. I'm Elizabeth Halford, Brand and Marketing Director here at Rise 8. And if you don't yet know who we are, Rise 8 is a full-stack digital transformation firm working in high compliance spaces to deliver vital software and continuously deliver a future where fewer bad things happen because of bad software. So today we're talking about cATO with some pretty heavy hitters in the space, this is a particularly exciting day and topic for us. Your host today is Riser Shane Quinlan, who has collaborated with me for months putting this together for you all. Thank you, Shane. While we're waiting for everyone to arrive, a little bit of housekeeping. The stream will go until 4:30 Eastern. We are streaming on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. All comments that you make will be aggregated into one dashboard for us. So please, wherever you're tuning in, ask questions and talk to us. And lastly, I'm very excited that for the first time, right here, right now, I'm announcing that our first live in-person event is happening in September 2022 in DC. We are partnering with WeWork to bring you Prod Academy, a software factory masterclass for those operating in high compliance spaces, as I know we all do. That's why you're here after all. We're still ironing out a lot of the details, but we have a really big name for our keynote speaker, which we can't announce just yet, but I'll be posting a link in the discussion area for a form where you can go and sign up to get more info as plans develop. Be the first person to know who that big name is. But for now, save the date, September 7th and 8th in Washington, D.C. for Prod Academy. Thank you so much for joining us. I trust that enough people are here now to get started. So Shane, I'm handing the floor over to you and our esteemed guests.
Hey everyone, hello and welcome. As we're getting everybody's face up here on the screen, I just wanted to say that this is the first in a two-part series that we're planning around continuous ATO. This session is focused around what it takes to get a continuous ATO and what it takes to build that from the ground up. The next session we're going to have is going to be about how you keep it and really how you perform that defense against the dark arts to fight off anything that can happen to spoil what a continuous ATO is supposed to achieve. So today we're here with a couple of really awesome folks who absolutely know what they're talking about. I'm here to help facilitate the discussion, but I'm going to walk my way around the room here and have folks tell us your name, tell us what you're doing now, and plug anything you want to plug right here off the top. So we'll start clockwise by where our faces are on the screen. So over to you.
So good afternoon. This is Danny Holtzman. I'm from the Air Force. I'm one of the authorizing officials for a series of activities in the Air Force. A lot of the cloud and DevSecOps are big activities like F-35, GBSD, and some other things. And I collaborate with the Navy, the Army, and DISA, and lots of other folks. I think my focus here is to listen more to the questions. I really like one of them already in the chat, to cATO or not to cATO. I think that was a very appropriate question somebody put in earlier, in really understanding what we're using it for and how we're using it and what our challenges are. I'll let the other folks introduce themselves. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Angel Fanoff. I come from the Army Software Factory. I am biased to say the best software factory in the DoD. Our soldiers are amazing. Shout out to everyone that joined this podcast to watch. When I think of this conversation, one thing you just said, Shane, is what it takes to get a cATO. I think we need to frame it as what it took to get a cATO, because things have changed since I think we initially put this podcast and wanting to talk about it together. There's new guidance around what a cATO is and how you can get one. I previously worked at Kessel Run, where Danny helped us with our cATO, and things from that memo that recently came out have changed. So I think we'll talk about that. I think it's over to Kroger.
Hey, Brian. Yeah, Brian Kroger, CEO of Rise 8. So yeah, I was on the ground at Kessel Run, one of the originals there at KR, and helped stand up the continuous ATO. And since then, we've helped Space Force as well as helping the VA stand up continuous ATOs. Really excited to talk with the folks on here. We got some real heavy hitters. Over to you.
Thank you. This is Lanye Ford. I don't know if it would be too cocky to say save the best for last. I'm not sure if that's true with this amazing cast here. But Lanye Ford, CEO of Arlo. From this perspective, I've been supporting DoD since I was 19, so I guess that's only 5 years. But pretty much all of my adult life in the realm of security before cybersecurity was a term. But specifically where our support has been assess and authorize. So risk management framework now, but I've supported DoD through DISCAP, through DICAP. Risk management is definitely my favorite. Co-authored the Fast Track ATO process on behalf of the Air Force. I currently support, our team currently support DoD JAIC, Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, and their efforts to lay out a strategy to get to CATO. I am here today with my clients and mentor and colleague, Mr. Holtzman. So we also support him across all the boundaries that he mentioned, coming into his boundary and helping him document the process that he's been doing for quite some time. So now we're looking at how do we document and scale. And also what we do is bring the teams together and baseline and build a foundation for the strategy to get after CATO. So I highlight that because my specific focus is going to be more around risk management, compliance, and how you get the actual CATO.
Awesome. Thank you all. Really appreciate y'all doing your intros. I want to start things off actually with the most controversial question in all of this. And it's, how do we actually say CATO? Do we have to spell it out, or can we say cATO is like a SQL kind of thing? Or what's the, how should people be saying it so we don't sound silly coming into the conversation?
CATO. I've never heard anyone use it as cATO.
I have, and it comes across so odd to me, but I agree. CATO is what I've heard too.
I think because the term ATO means so much that when you try to say it as something else, it just doesn't resonate.
Awesome. There you go.
People might also think you're a libertarian think tank. Cato Institute.
Awesome. Thanks. So I know that's silly, but sometimes people coming into this, it's hard to know exactly what to make of acronyms. So just getting some clarity even on the basics can go a long way in helping you sound like you know what you're talking about when you come into the conversation, which is huge. What I'd really like to start this off with is not knowing exactly where all of our attendees are at with their knowledge around CATOs. Can one of you give me an elevator pitch for what a continuous authority to operate is? First come, first serve.
So I'll tell you from my view, right, and maybe it's a little bit of an Air Force focus, but as Angel said, we are very steeped in working with DoD on the CATO activity and memo, which I can talk about later. To me, regardless of the term, whether it's little c, big ATO, or ATO-C with conditions, right, there's always been the ability to provide a continuous assessing and authorization environment. It, to me, is the most mature, strategically difficult to obtain, hardest to maintain environment where we have very good visibility, lots of expert systems, if you will, in terms of we understand what the system is, we understand the data flowing through it, we understand the change. So to me, a CATO represents the North Star. It's hard to get. How do we get to a place where we all understand what the risk of use is in whatever operational context we're talking about? Over.
For me, a ATO is more than just an authorization. It's assurance. Continuous authorization means continuous assessment and understanding your security and your compliance postures. It's a paradigm shift from, I'd say, the traditional ATO, which is a snapshot in time. And it's rather more of like a live feed of your operations and of your program in an agile way that's more not only just operating, but mitigating the risk as you go along.
Yes, and then just to add to that, in total agreement, and I think to understand CATO, the audience and the folks have to understand what DevSecOps perspective, and we're looking at culture and practices that kind of enable organizations to bridge the gap between our developer teams, our security team, and our operations team, so that we can deliver rapid software, securely. And from DoD's perspective, well, let me say this, and a part of that is the CI/CD pipeline, making sure that we can continuously integrate and deliver. So from a DoD perspective, that has been difficult for us because we do have authorizing officials. We do have people in place that has to assess and authorize. And so that adds a significant amount of time to that continuous delivery. So one of the goals, I think, moving forward to a CATO is to assist us with moving quicker with delivery from a software perspective.
My version's like a lot more boring because I wish we didn't start calling it cATO. I think to Angel's point, it kind of puts the focus on authorize when there are a bunch more steps in RMF. So I really wish we would have gone with continuous RMF back when we were naming things and marketing them. And I just say that because really what it is to me is making RMF concurrent with your DevOps. So shifting left and doing RMF concurrent with your software development lifecycle, such that you're always doing assess, authorize, and monitor on your system.
So Shane, if I could follow up on that, I think, Brian, that's a good point. My struggle in this naming convention world, right, is I've been doing continuous assessing and authorizing on all of my authorizations since I became an authorizing official, right? Having helped Ron Ross with 800-160 and the RMF framework, I like to separate. I don't want to bash the ATO. There's nothing really wrong with an ATO or the RMF framework. We've implemented it in a way that causes us to prosecute things in a certain way. So that cultural change, Angel, you mentioned, I think is key. The understanding, Lanya, you mentioned, I think is very important. There's nothing today, and just being honest, in the guidance out there that allows us. I've never found the guidance that says be stupid. I just haven't seen it written anywhere. I think it's interpretation. I think it's a cultural challenge. And I think we typically try to level set everything to the lowest common denominator so anybody can do it and follow a checklist. And this is expert system kinds of stuff. And you can't always have one with the other. Over.
And I totally agree with that. And I think that's where DoD struggles, because we have so many different levels of expertise working in DoD, from an airman basic at a base to, some amazing contractors that truly understand what this is. And so I think we've had the ability to do cATO, but DoD is the environment where the agencies are looking for direction. So like the RMF has definitely told us that we can do ongoing authorization actually for a very long time. It talks through having a continuous monitoring strategy, managing real time, all those things that we're trying to get to. The framework identified that. But from that, what DoD is expected to do is take that guidance, because people look at that as a guidance, and create DoD guidance and policy. Then from DoD, the guidance and policy, then the Air Force or the agency creates their policy and guidance. And I think what's happened is that because we didn't have that direction outside of like the NIST documentation, number one, people didn't necessarily move in that direction because they're waiting for specific guidance from DoD. And it's a struggle because some people want you to tell them exactly how to do it, exactly what the template is, exactly where to go. And then others want you to let them be. So I think striking that balance is difficult but necessary.
And I think, Shane, if you don't mind, one last thought on that topic. There's a couple of questions in the chat that this links all this conversation together, right? I've been working very closely with DoD CIO on the cATO memo and where we're going to define the criteria. I think that it is maybe more appropriate to say the intent of it is to set, from DoD CIO, to set the understanding of what a cATO means in the DoD. We're all using it differently. It means different things to different people. So it's hard to define a set of criteria, right? Nick and I started off in the Air Force focusing on DevSecOps only, right? And how we could achieve from that perspective, software focused delivery. not necessarily the hardware platforms or PIT platforms or other things. Other services are using it in different ways. Other programs are using it in different ways. I think the intent, well, I know the intent from talking about this with them, is that their goal is to assess the AO himself or herself as well as the program to determine if the ecosystem on both sides supports the continuous AO intention of having that conmon, because it's not just a program, it's the AO environment. So there's two sides to the coin. And once they set that bar and they have a service or an AO that goes through the process and they agree is at that maturity level, is to push it back down. It's not a service CISO authorization necessarily. Most CISOs are not authorizing officials. So that's a little bit of a fundamental challenge we have to work our way through if we're going to implement things. But the CISO should be helping set, in my opinion, setting the bar for the AOs to achieve to within those services. So I think for me, whatever we all believe a cATO is, I think the community might help us define what it looks like, right? Is it infrastructure, people and processes? Is it focused on DevSecOps? Is it focused on dashboarding, supply chain? What are those things? I'll go one step further. There's nothing in that memo that isn't already part of the RMF. There's nothing in that memo that says you shouldn't already be doing all of this already. There's nothing we're doing today that we weren't doing 3 years ago. The tooling's different. The technology is different. Our belief and culture is different, and that'll continue to evolve. So those are my thoughts to help spark the conversation over.
Yeah, I struggle on that too. Somebody asked me once, why not just call it ongoing authorization? And I think to Lanye's point, ongoing authorization has been around for a long time. It doesn't, there are a lot of people doing ongoing authorizations that look nothing like DevOps, right? They're maybe updating their system once a quarter or maybe even once a year. But that ongoing authorization is really, and any AO in the service can grant an ongoing authorization, but it's you working directly with your AO to set up those processes and even the people aspects and the technology aspects at a risk level that they're willing to accept. And I think, I always said cATO was just the specific implementation that Kessel Run chose. And now as more people are doing it, it probably makes sense to start delineating it further on, there's like a DevOps pathway for authorizations. And there's maybe somebody that's early in their agile journey, like they shouldn't be doing a 3-year ATO, but they're not quite ready for a full blown, what we call continuous ATO at the software factories. So I think there's a lot of room to grow the pathways and give people different options based on their level of maturity. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important to emphasize what Danny said, which is even in the memo, hopefully we talk about it later. It'll be a spicy topic because there's some things about the memo I don't like. But as far as newness, there's nothing new in that memo that wasn't already in RMF as requirements or compliance items. So I do think that there's like a psychological aspect to it from an organizational change perspective that's important to consider. And I think that part of it is problematic. And I hope V2, because I'm going to let them be agile and iterate on their memo, I hope V2 kind of improves that and helps the community see it more as an opportunity than a scary thing that they have to go to the DoD CISO for.
Yeah, some of my favorite things I've seen in the conversations so far have been people coming back to things like the FAR and the RMF and saying, the boundary or the ceiling was always there. We could work within this. We always had the capabilities, and even not just the capabilities, but the push and the justification to move towards this kind of thinking. So, but we've had different systems up to this point. The cATO represents something new and unique. So I guess the best thing we can do is define by comparison. So looking at existing frameworks or the ATO that folks might be more familiar with, what makes a cATO different? And why is that difference important? I know we've been kind of hitting at it in different places, but Angel, maybe you want to take that one?
I think it's accountability. I think there's a very big difference in accountability. Like a cATO requires consistent accountability to establish the agreed upon levels of risk, where a traditional ATO can go years without review or revision. It shouldn't, but in reality, it does. I mean, it happens. A program has an opportunity to increase the change in its time, and the change is not always risk positive, right? Sometimes it goes the other way. And I think culture aspect, I mean, I was a part of a program that Mr. Holtzman, you signed a 3-year ATO for us. And it was perceived in the culture aspect that, hey, you got the ATO and see you in 3 years. And you would have kind of quarterly check-ins with the SCAB team or with people out of his office. But it was just kind of casual, like, hey, are you on the rails? Are you off the rails? Does everything look good? Does everything not look good? And people weren't updating their controls. I mean, I was updating the controls because I was trying to get other things. But that's besides the point. You actually got me those other things. You were at the car wash and signed something else for me. So that's like a very unique case of like working a traditional ATO and having someone be able to enable you and help you do the things you need to do. And so the car wash reference was like, it was way after hours. I think we called you at like 8 p.m. at night and you were like, I've already left base. What do you need? Traditional ATOs, you don't have enablers that are going to help push you forward most of the time. And I think when people look at it from a new perspective, it's a culture perspective of creating a good relationship with your AO to enable you the traditional mindset. Like you can continue to do that. You can push the boundaries. You don't need to go get a cATO, but you have to change the culture of how you interact with your AO and how you continuously work together so you can achieve the outcomes you need to achieve.
I'm going to say, add something on there too, or maybe what it's not. And some folks might disagree with me on this one actually, but hear me out. It is not authorizing the people in the process. And those exact words have been said very publicly by some of the leadership in the community. And I just want to, remind everybody that we authorize systems. And you consider people in process, no doubt. Like that's an important step in mitigating or reducing risk. But we do not authorize people's and processes and then trust those. There has to be a system authorization. We have to assure that we're getting the outcomes that the people in process are intended to achieve. And I think that just to be frank, the community got a little bit fast and loose with that for quite some time. In getting an initial, just like you would in the old system that Angel talked about of, you get a 3-year ATO, they got their continuous ATO. Everybody's like, oh, look at their culture, look at their processes. This is great. But there was no assurance after that. I think we need to get back to some of the basics on like compliance shouldn't be a dirty word. I say this all the time, but known security vulnerabilities lend themselves very well to checklists. Known issues in general lend themselves well to checklist type of approaches. That's not where we need Agile. That's where we need like Lean Six Sigma. Where we need discovery is, new threats, threat hunting, those types of things. So there's still a place for that. Don't get me wrong. It's compliance but definitely think that's important to highlight.
I think that's a good point you both make, right? I think from my view, we're talking about an expert system environment, right? A system of systems, which I view all authorizations as, is complicated. And the moment we authorize it, we're out of date, we're wrong, because we got to manage change from that point on. So I talk about a continuous ATO for me and anything I'm looking at in my continuous process, which I call Vulcan logic, just to make a fun pun against my call sign, right? So if we have that visibility and that relationship Andrew spoke of, if the AOs are equipped, and they're unfortunately not within the DoD, we're not resourced, we're not equipped, we're not given enough time to do this job. It's as is what it is, right? I tend to focus on this primarily as an HQE. I can afford to do that, but that takes a lot of energy. But I think to your point, Brian, I think that whatever the system is, to me, the first question always is, what is it you want me to authorize? What's the thing under assessment that I need to authorize? And what is the operational mission and ConOps of that thing? If I don't start there and understand that, then assessing risk doesn't have context, which, risk is temporal and is contextual. And we could spend all day assessing vulnerabilities. That's not the goal. The goal is to assess risk, and not all vulnerabilities equal risk. So if we understand what it is we're assessing and what it is we're using it for, right? If you're building software for nuclear weapons, that's a lot different than building software for an S&T environment. And you may have multiple lines in your factory, right, that produce different levels of tooling environments to different level of degrees of flexibility and degrees of rigor. So that's okay. right? I liken it to, I would like to live in a world where every piece of software has a risk of use sticker on it. Like you go to the grocery store. I know, Angel, you've heard this before. You go to the grocery store, there's a nutritional facts label. You as the consumer can understand the risk of consuming that product. How do we get there for software? How do you know the software that came off of this factory has this risk to it? Because nothing is risk-free. That's a fantasy. Nothing is free of error. That's a fantasy, in my opinion. So how do we understand and change to a consumer producer environment where the producer's producing software in a way that they can inform the consumer? You know, you need to use nuclear weapons, use this one. It costs more, it's more rigor. You need to do some S&T work, quick and dirty, use this one. It costs less, it has less rigor. That's all okay. That's risk and context of the environment. And to me, that's what we're struggling with, because we try to standardize everything. We don't, Six Sigma lean it out. We try to make it to the point everybody can follow the checklist instead of understanding that this is work to assess risk. Over.
Yeah, that nutrition label, we did that. I'm not saying we did it well, but we definitely did it and tried it out. There was a lot of challenges with that. I think that if we could, I still think there's value in that, like definitely having like a health scorecard to software that we're using, and in the environment, it would inform customers. But when we were trying to do that, I know we came into many pain points, but still think it's a good idea.
It's an evolution, Angel, right? I think those early days of the label made us really understand, in my opinion, we've evolved a lot and we're still learning. We didn't really know how to describe those 10 things we wanted to measure. And we're learning more and more as we go. So I think we are maturing as a community as well through trial and error to get to that point where we can describe those X amount of things. That is one of the things I'm working on with DoD CIO on, by the way, as we continue the discussion on the CATOs. What does it mean and how do we measure it? How do I create a common measuring stick that other AOs can measure to, that you all can achieve to, and then we can understand that I'm not doing it the same. The tooling's not the same. The environment's not the same, because that will stunt growth and productivity and inventiveness. And one thing I know is whatever tool we're using today is not the tool we're going to be using tomorrow. So we have to enable ourselves. And I think getting to what we can measure, the bias of measurement is also important. Brian, you mentioned the Six Sigma activities. We have a tendency, at least in the government, I've noticed, to bias the results by what we think we know unconsciously. And then we don't like the behaviors we drove, so we then reinvent something new. And I think that's a challenge we're still learning. Over.
Yeah. One thing that was said earlier, and I'm a bit of an odd duck in this, in that I'm a huge advocate for controls. I already kind of said it once, but as Danny said, there's not always a one-to-one correlation between controls and risk, and that's why we have the ability to comment things, do tailored control selections. There are controls that just don't make sense for the cloud, just to be frank. There's a lot of things I might change about NIST, but as imperfect as it is, I think it's also really great. And by the way, their documentation is also fantastic, which is not something I often get to say. I actually enjoy reading their documentation. But I think it's important to say that because we get all hung up around the edges on technology implementations like Istio and mutual TLS and layer 7. We're like, oh yeah, and then somebody leaves their S3 bucket misconfigured in their dev environment. And I just want those are the kinds of things where, again, as much as people don't want to hear about checklists when they're, just starting their agile DevOps journey, there are things that you just need to check. And some of them might be irrelevant. And then you just say that. And if you have a good relationship with your SCAs and your AOs, and that's part of establishing a continuous ATO, is establishing a new process that has new type of collaboration between SCAs, AOs, and the development teams. Once you get to that point, it's really easy to make that change. But it's important that you're still going through that checklist. And I say that because somebody in here asked, there's kind of two related questions. One was like, hey, I've heard continuous ATO is getting an ATO, and then continuous is like a layer on top of that. I would say kind of maybe just to reframe that whole thing is it's just always on ATO. You're always doing all the steps of RMF at any given time. So people that think that continuous ATO is somehow getting them away from having to do NIST and RMF are really wrong. It's actually doing it all the time. It's way harder.
Yes.
It's a lot more work. It's exhausting. And as that relates to FedRAMP is a really great baseline. Your provisional ATOs coming out of FedRAMP are a really great baseline for you to inherit controls and have a controls package already built for you, provided that it's one that you trust. And I think they're a trustworthy community. And so that's how I would tie those concepts together for those that are looking for that.
And I would add, and I do definitely not alone with understanding the importance of using controls, because it's also our baseline taxonomy. So if you want to talk about reciprocity and those type of things, that's how all of the organizations communicate. So you're going in with at least a baseline understanding of specific areas that you've addressed, and it's easy to communicate. I think where we went wrong, and when I say we, in this case, I'm referring to security practitioners. We were speaking security language, and security speak to everyone. Danny, as an AO and as an executive level, should he be hearing about CM-1 and CM-3? No, he shouldn't. Should he be hearing about AC? No. You have to understand the intent of the control. So though we do on the, and I tell Danny this all the time when he says no control, and I always follow up, I'll work on the under the waterline things. That's what I tell. So what I do is I will consider myself like a translator. So I listen to, this is what the leadership is looking for. This is what your decision making is looking for. Then I translate that information to our implementers. And a lot of that translation is a crosswalk into controls. If I know that you are, and Danny's looking at access control as one of his baselines, okay, I'll say that access to Danny. But when I'm talking to the actual SCIS or the ISM community, I may relate that information back into controls. And so I think it's not one of the issues, I think, as far as people pushing back on controls, is we have not done an effective job of communicating the intent of them. And I agree in totality that checklists are needed. Compliance is needed. Sometimes compliance is used to see when you're missing something, right? And I also think it goes back to the skill level of our workforce. Our workforce is so varied in skill and expertise. I mean, we could have a whole session on just the workforce. We talk a lot about the technology, but in my mind, we really leave out the workforce, and that is the most important piece of this pie, specifically when we're talking cATO, because building a cATO, getting the technology, that's one piece. The people that can manage this and maintain the security posture, that's where the difficult part comes in. And so I think that as we look at cATO and controls, I also think what's highlighted more in cATO than typical RMF is, we always say people, process, and technology, but cATO highlights teams. And from a teaming perspective, that's different. We're looking at how does the dev, the sec, the ops, how do the teams work together? And I think how we looked at traditional RMF in the past, we hadn't looked at it as a team sport. So I think that's another change that we're seeing from a cultural perspective in cATO.
But before we start jumping into some of the actionable things that people can start doing to work towards the culture change required, the pieces required to actually build out the cATO, maybe it's useful to take a look back, do a little, like a short retrospective on what cATO has meant from origin to now, and talk about some of the things that have happened. And let's talk about that memo too. And then jump into what we think some of those first steps, next steps, best recommendations, things that people on the ground, your ISOs, your ISMs, can actually do to help make the change happen. So, Brian, if you don't mind, I'm going to pass the mic to you to talk about that origin story, because I think you're the right guy to kick that off.
Yeah, I think this is a huge lesson learned in why you should document things very thoroughly. Could have taken a lesson learned from NIST in that regard. We didn't document this well at all in Kessel Run, and we had really high turnover. And so a lot of the original things are lost. And there's also some other things I'll say that have compounded as things scale, and they broke at scale, that cause people to drift away from especially good continuous monitoring. But to give it a start, I mean, going back to the beginning, we did the nitty gritty hard work of mapping all of the controls for the original dev environment, the platform, which we used Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and then the prod environment, which was actually on-prem hardware running PCF as well. And being able to inherit controls across those environments seamlessly is important, and keep them in sync, because AWS is releasing very frequent updates compared to the on-prem solution that we were using, and then Pivotal Cloud Foundry was releasing major releases every quarter, oftentimes minor releases every month, and so it's a lot to keep up. And I just say that because when we talk about things like FedRAMP too, like the people become a bottleneck that are doing the controls assessment and authorization. And so that's where automation is really needed. And otherwise, as you scale, people stop doing that. And I think, just to be frank, that's what started to happen. We needed to pull more and more commercial technology into our pipelines, into our dev environments, into our prod environments. And there just became this huge bottleneck for being able to do all of that controls work and then keep up with the POAMs, keep up with updates, and making sure that when there's a major release, we're updating our controls, et cetera. But yeah, we did all of that hard work, and then we used SD elements and a fairly opinionated release pipeline to, SD elements injects the app level controls. And I say app level, I just want to clarify, there is no such thing as app level controls. There's just the controls that are left over at the app layer. So if you use a different platform than Kessel Run, you're going to have a different app set of controls. So if you use a very less opinionated, raw Kubernetes, your controls mapping at the app layer looks very different than very super opinionated PCF. And I'm not advocating by any means for using PCF today in 2022, but I'm just saying very opinionated platform. And so, I just emphasize this side of the story because it's not the one that you always hear. Early on in KR, when we were just a few apps strong and just got our continuous ATO, and I'm not saying they don't have this today, I just can't vouch, I'm not there anymore. We could produce a full body of evidence for every application on the platform in any environment that it was running in. And that's really important to be able to do. And we could provide a risk profile for it. Two things that I'll say, I mentioned two things that I think caused us to get away. One is that automation. We had good automation on the SD element side for getting your initial app to prod. There wasn't a lot that was keeping things up to date as people upgraded and added new interfaces and pulled in new technologies. And so I think that's a prime area to explore additional automation. And then the other thing was something that Danny said earlier. There was an exchange between Danny and Lanya. I'm not sure if everyone heard it right. Danny's like, I don't care about controls. And Lanya's like, yeah, you kind of shouldn't. Your job is to worry about risk. My job is to worry about controls. But I think leadership saying they didn't care about controls, which is true and shouldn't, right? But that message trickled down in the wrong way to now we had practitioners saying oh, Brian's trying to tell me I got to do controls, but I heard, 3 SESs say that we don't care about controls anymore. And people started getting away from controls to the point where they're making meme jokes on LinkedIn about it, very publicly. And it's kind of gross and gives the community a bad name. And I think that's where some divergence happened. And I've really been excited. And I want to hear Angel at some point too, because I know the Army has brought that way back in and is really focused on the right way to do that. So I'm excited to see that.
And I think, Brian, the lesson I learned through this process, right? So it's unfortunate how we've used language in the past, right, to break culture and chime in. When you understand what a control is, right, you don't do a control to do a control, right? The doorstop is a control. The bumper on your car is a control. A fuse is electrical control. Controls mitigate something. And when we invented that term, back in the day, there was only 53, and they were validated, they were focused, they meant something. When we ballooned to over 900, we lost understanding of they were mitigations to a risk. So I like to say now, I've evolved in my communications is I go right to left instead of left to right. I want to understand what the system, the context, the environment is, what the risk is in those environments, and then how I mitigate that risk, which may translate itself into control. If I start the checklist the other way, what I have seen happen and what we've learned through KR and the other 12 different factories we've authorized in the Air Force is we've automated all of the bad really fast. So we can automate that body of evidence of 7,000 plus pages. We're not in any better risk posture position. We just generate the same paper faster. And Ms. Krausberg and I would really, really love to tell industry we would like to ban the term ATO as a service, right? I think that is the worst thing we can do. It's not about generating paperwork. It's about understanding the risk construct and being able to articulate that in a way that allows agility, that recognizes that change. So we've evolved in the conversation. I actually now liken a cATO to a NASCAR team, right? You've got the driver that represents our user. You've got the pit crew, which supports the driver. You've got the team manager, which is the maestro of all of that. And a high performing NASCAR team, operates on milliseconds of difference in differentials from winning to losing. And everything is changing. Track conditions, cars around you, tire speed, all of that stuff is changing simultaneously all at the same time while you're in the middle of a race driving. To me, that's what a cATO represents. How do I separate myself from that up top in a God's eye view and see all of that happening? We did a lot of experimentation. We learned a lot. I don't think any of it was bad. I think it was all learning. We also started off, to your question, Shane, we started off, at least Nick and I did, with a very rigid view that cATO in a pipeline environment was one development, one production, very tightly coupled. And I think we've evolved to learn that that's not a good thing. You have to have multiple projects, being able to share apps across different dev environments and vice versa. And that creates another layer of the onion because we've biased our tooling and we've hard-coded our apps to the tooling. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. But I think as we evolve our communications and change that term, I like to say risk area is represented by controls now instead of controls, because we're not training and educating our ISMs and others and giving them the time to retool and catch up. I think that's a big challenge we have as a community. We're giving them, 27 hours to do in a day, and like it or not, they can't. So I think there's some challenges as we've grown our communications over.
One thing I'll say on the kind of one-to-one mapping of app platform infrastructure, I think that's a little bit hard to get away from, in the sense that the controls inheritance or risk mitigation inheritance can be very different across those stacks. And so I think what's missing there is, if you want to be a platform provider, and this isn't just a DoD compliance thing, Amazon commercial, Azure commercial, Google, they all provide you with a shared responsibility matrix. Here's what I'm responsible for, here's what we share responsibility for, and here's what you're responsible for. And for their gov regions, they do that using NIST controls. So you have the big companies that were all trying to replicate their development and deployment speeds doing this as well. I think even if you're offering your platform internally, right? Kessel Run originally was not intending to offer their platform up to the rest of the Air Force or the DoD. I know that changed at some point, but internally to teams, we offered that up as, these are the controls you're inheriting from us. And teams were allowed to use other platforms. This is not well known, but there were teams at Kessel Run that chose not to use the Kessel Run platform. They deployed to NGA, and then they were responsible for inheriting controls and going through that organization to get that ATO. And so I don't see getting away from that. But what I do see that we need to do as a community is provide a lot better transparency on what controls you're able to inherit, particularly from GOTS platforms if we're going to build them, because that transparency is just not there, and nobody can even provide them on request. So the commercial companies are doing a pretty good job of this, but definitely the GOTS solutions and the GOTS teams have a long ways to go.
And I think what I've seen is, though this isn't a specific role, that many organizations would benefit for having what I will call a cybersecurity integrator, or someone that comes in up front and help them develop what that strategy looks like. Because there's no one size fits all, organizations are really struggling from that perspective, especially when we talk about inheritance, right? If we're looking at cATO as our infrastructure has its own authorization, and then from that infrastructure, our platform inherits that all of those controls or specific controls. And I think even from that perspective, like you're talking about the different in industry, they're talking to their different partners using controls. Same thing has to happen in government, because there's a lot of handoff now. We may have one vendor that's building the infrastructure, right? And so if our platform wants to inherit those controls, that it has to be a conversation, and most of the time contractual. So that means that we have to start planning way ahead of when we're planning now, when we're actually in the factory. There's a big acquisition component to this that we don't necessarily discuss, that I think is fundamental, and I think is hurting us because we're not discussing, and it's costing us more money, because there has to be, not only that, we have someone handling infrastructure, we have someone else building a pipeline, may have another vendor that's doing the applications, and then after it's built, they're handing it off to someone to do O&M. Now, once you do that, who's responsible for those controls or the patches, or, so I think from number one, from an acquisition standpoint, we have to start much earlier, kind of identifying what our strategy is to include in what our assess and authorize strategy is.
Angel, as someone who's worked across 2 different services trying to implement something like this, have you seen anything in retrospect over the last couple of years since jumping into the cATO world that stands out to you or is worth talking about here?
Do the controls. I think that's like the simplest thing. Like, do the controls. Controls aren't bad. I think in the past, like has been hit on before, like it was, the legacy mindset. And all we're doing is just doing things a little bit faster, but you still have to generate the same amount of stuff. You still have to show that you can do this. So, do the controls and then find ways to automate those controls, and then document that you've automated those controls, and document how many times you go back and check that those controls are being done correctly. And that's it, right? Like, that's just make sure you're doing your stuff and make sure you write it down. So Kroger was like coming in you were on your way out as I was coming in. We had like a very brief overlap at Kessel Run together. And so like a lot of the stuff that he's like, hey, this was the pain point when I was at KR. I was like, yeah, I lived that pain point, and then we fixed it. And so Danny was kind of along the way, the whole way with us through that process. But do the controls. I'd say one of the biggest lessons learned is write your documentation. Show how, if you're going to automate something, if a scanner is going to answer these amount of controls, write it down somewhere. Have a master, I can't believe I'm going to say this, have a master sheet somewhere that says, these controls are covered by doing this. We do this thing X amount of times a month, a year, a day, an hour. And we go back and we check to make sure that that thing is doing the right thing every month. We check and make sure, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? Yes. Awesome. Great. Because when you go in front of an AO, such as Mr. Holtzman, Danny, you have to say, hey, I'm doing this thing. This is how I'm doing this thing. These things answered these controls. So I don't have to actually go write out the control. I do this thing and it makes it happen. He's going to turn around and say, well, how many times did you do it? When's the last time you checked it? So you just write your documentation. Your documentation doesn't have to look like the old way it used to, and do continuous monitoring smartly, like figure it out, and I would say be very transparent and ask for help. So that's like one of, I think, the biggest things that I can say that I've done throughout my time. I joined the Air Force as a contractor, and I think everyone got so sick of me. I was like, help me. I don't understand this. Help me. I was over at Mr. Holtzman's building, I want to say like every day, because I worked right across the street, and I like would walk over and sit there and bug everyone in his office. How do you do this? How do I get help? How do you make it happen? So the biggest lesson learned is like find a way of how you're going to keep your documentation in a standardized way. It doesn't have to be the way that maybe people did it 20 years ago. Find a new innovative way of how you want to keep track of it, but have it written down somewhere, because if you up and win the lottery, make sure that the person that's coming in to fill your seat next is able to understand what you did. And when you leave or you promote or you go on, that continuity can be continued to deliver that program, all of the hard work that you have done.
Yeah, 2 things you just reminded me of that are super important. At one point in KR, we used to call them the things that were being injected into the backlog from SD Elements. We called them chores. We had different types, and we were using Pivotal Tracker at the time. And we switched to calling them features precisely for the reason that you were saying. And I think it could be adopted at the platform and infrastructure layer as well, is really we're describing mitigations or like behaviors. If we were building software and these features, right? It's a behavior that I'm trying to achieve in the software. And then how do I test that, right? Maybe we may even start writing the tests first and do like TDD for, NIST compliance. But I think that's super important. When you said that, I just thought that was incredible. And then, I left out one really important part about all the people at Danny's office, but one big change that we made that I would advocate to everybody is like a really good pattern to follow is, Kessel Run, and it was still independent, but we sent money to Danny's office for additional SCAR support. That was specialized SCAR support. We got them from Beyond Mission Capable Solutions, really great team. And they brought in a ton of folks that had both cyber security, InfoSec expertise, and software expertise. And those folks could get into our backlogs, which we gave them access to, into our code bases, and actually review things, and not just to check us, but also to help us implement a lot of the mitigations that we needed to implement. So that's a super important thing that I would recommend to everybody.
The next thing.
And Brian, I want to.
Oh, go ahead, Lanya.
You say something?
Go ahead, Lanya. Go for it.
No, I was going to say, just to piggyback, Brian, that the issue that we're having, one of the issues I think we're having from a larger workforce is that we are expecting a lot of people to be experts, and that expertise is just not out there. And so one thing that you just mentioned, finding organizations that already have the expertise that you can bring into the fold and bring into the environment and already know this is what I need to do for a CATO. We're in some programs, and I'm a contractor, so I'm not, I'm talking about myself too, but we go in some of these programs, the government brings these people on contracts, right? And guess what? They don't understand. So now the government is paying they're paying this contractor and this vendor to learn on our dime. And I say government's dime is our dime, to learn on our dime, to get up to speed. It is taking them over a year or so to even understand not only the CATO culture, but the DoD culture, which is different. And so I think if we looked at how we can restructure our workforce where we can have shared resources, and this is something that Danny is doing in his boundary too, have shared resources. He onboards his CRAs, he trains his CRAs, and then now I can hold you some expectation. This is what I want to be delivered and how I want it to be delivered. But at least they had a baseline, and they appreciate it. They appreciate it because right now there's no specific training for that. I'm not referring to CBTs. I'm referring to how do we get people in our organization that understands what we're doing. And again, culture, policy, strategy, automation, and that's a lot. And not continue to paying people to learn the same thing over and over, paying different vendors. I do think that that's an area that we need to focus on. And I do think that that's a recommendation from a program perspective that I will recommend as well.
And I think to tie some of that together, right, what we've learned, at least the journey I started on when I said no 3 times before the Air Force said you can't say no anymore, you're an AO, right, was along that journey was you want me to be an AO and you give me no money, no resources. So part of the challenge is being clinical about it. Are we serious about this, or is it just another piece of paper for a checklist? When I was a chief engineer in a weapons system, I had 13 certifications to get signed before we could go into production. Cyber, or IA at the time, was one of them. So there is a world outside of cyber. You have to recognize programs have a lot of things to do, right? And 1 ounce of cyber, 1 control equals 1 mile of gas the plane can't fly, equals 1 bullet it can't shoot, equals all of those things. And that has to be weighed in. Cyber's a commander's business if we get this right. It's not from the bottoms up. And I think part of that journey is it changed my thinking. So in order to succeed, I created what I called a fee-for-service environment, what you at Kessel Run and all the other programs call extortion. So programs have to pay me in order for me to exercise my risk assessment, but it put me in a consumer provider environment. I am a service provider to the risk takers. In the acquisition world, that's the PEO and their programs. They own cost, schedule, performance. I do not. I can put them on report in a way that is hand-holding, going together, saying this is the risk we're going down. In the operational world, there is an operational system commander owner who puts kids at risk, right? Let's remember what we do in the DoD. So we're putting children at risk out in the mission in the real world based on what we do here. So how do we express risk in that context, to me, is important. As an element of this that I think is worth noting, and some of the questions talked about EMAS and how do we do EMAS and how do we do all of these things. The RMF is a tiered structure if you really understand what it is. There's an organization, there's an enterprise organization and system level view. As AOs, or actually technically speaking, I'm a delegated AO. Ms. Klausenberger is the only Air Force AO. There's one per service, and they delegate down a subset of responsibility. In the Air Force, there's about 27 delegations. I've got multiple of those, but there's only 27. But we look at things in a lens at the system level. There's also needs of the organization and needs of the enterprise. And the tooling like EMAS and others, whatever the tool you use, Exacta, EMAS, your own database, is a partnership between the program and the AO. The programs are responsible for their investment accounts, for establishing those environmental parameters inside of an EMAS or an Exacta, if we do this according to the way we're supposed to. The AO does their job and documents their decision inside of the tool for others to see. And I call reciprocity an analysis, not a checklist, right? So can I understand and trust that you did your risk right and what the tolerance of the item is? Does that risk fit my tolerance? To me, that's a reciprocity analysis. I liken it to a form fit function. So I think as we look at this activity, how do we communicate that differently? Lanya, your point. As an AO, maybe I enjoy getting into the details of things more than others do, but I think I need to understand the real risk. But how do I communicate? When I go talk to my operators, my 4-stars, my COCOM commanders, and I talk about STIGs and ACAS scans and DRs, their eyes glaze over. But when I talk about the cyber risk to training, the cyber risk to sortie generation, the cyber risk to mission execution, the cyber risk to reconstitution, they perk up in their chairs. So we have to translate, in my view, what we are talking about at those various levels. And then there is the enterprise level, right? A COCOM commander may be able to get a bolt at Joey Bag of Donuts down the corner and put it on the landing gear of one jet. They put one jet and one pilot at risk. Cyber is very different. Cyber is connecting everything to everything in real time. And the commander doesn't have necessarily the right ability to accept that risk to the enterprise of injecting bad data back in. So I think it's still a maturing concept of how we're executing it, and getting to a cATO, to me, pulling it back into, Shane, what you asked earlier, getting to a cATO to me is that holy grail. How do we have that entire ecosystem working in a way that we've learned all the lessons of the past and we're driving to a better, I call cyber a journey, right? I want it to be a little more secure today than yesterday, a little more secure tomorrow than today. We're always learning, we're always growing, we're always changing. It's not about you didn't do 17 controls, right? It's about you have risk that you didn't mitigate. We all accept risk, right? You all came to work or down the hallway in your house to your home office today, right? Lightning could have struck you, geese could have attacked you, drunk drivers could have hit you. We live in a world of risk. The goal is not secure. The goal is risk management. Over.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think to what you're saying too, like it's something we have to make sure we're continuing to connect back to what the operational environment looks like and what that needs to be. I know it's something that kind of got touched on. I think I saw someone drop a question on chat around what to think about in terms of operational risk as well. But interested in how we think about that and how that sort of forms the core of the why behind not just cATO, but what we're thinking about when it comes to security, compliance, assurance, all of that.
So for me, I came up with these 4 categories because a 4-star, at ACC beat my head up and down over these things, telling me that's what he wanted to hear. I think operational risk still needs context to define it. Is your operation, airplanes? Is that your risk? What's your mission? Is your operations the data security of our SAP data? Are very, very closely hold information we don't want leaked? Is your operational risk the context of Cybercom or AppCyber's view? So I don't think there's one view of operational risk, just like there's not one view of how to exercise or execute an ATO environment. So again, for me, anyways, what I've evolved to understanding, if at the beginning you define what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, what the ConOps is, and what that operational context is, you can then assess risk to that measuring stick, which may be different than somebody else's measuring stick because their operational context is different. I may have a vulnerability that is a risk on an airplane at, for example, at the test site in Edwards in Nevada. That is a different operational risk context than my flying planes out in theater. So I can accept the risk in one context and not the other. And let's make it clearer. When we go to war and we need those 16 airplanes sitting on the sideline we don't fly in peacetime, they get up in the air. Risk tolerance changes. And that's an important aspect I think we're missing when we talk just about the lowest level view of, are you doing a control? Yes, you need to understand that, but you're doing it because you're mitigating something. And there are times when that mitigation is less important. Over.
And I would add to that when we look at operational risk, sir, as you mentioned, it really, I'll say this, even our structure from an AO perspective probably needs to be relooked at, right? Because the operational risk for our legacy systems, which I would say in the Air Force is probably 90% of our systems. So we talk a lot about innovation. The majority of our systems are legacy systems. Those AOs may not have the same breadth of knowledge and understand the operational risk and context to some of our more innovative systems. So I think really understanding what system should go in what bucket for what AO to make decisions is going to be very important, and we need to streamline that process.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's a false dichotomy of, I can either go fast and not be compliant or have quality, or, the opposite there. And that's just not true. You can go fast and meet all the controls, et cetera. There's not really a trade-off needed, especially, I mentioned there's room for better automation in this space for sure, still to this day. But in general, I don't think we have to make that trade-off. And so then the question just becomes, why aren't you doing it? Because delay is risk. Delay is the worst form of operational risk, comes from delay. The cost of delay in the DoD is measured in lives. Someday it could be measured in the freedom of our country. And so I think we just really need to flip the narrative there and say, we have to go fast, but that doesn't mean go fast and break things. We have to go fast and be able to include all of these mitigations along the way and not make excuses for not being able to complete the mitigations. And if you want me to go fast, I have to throw NIST out the window. No, you don't. We've proven that over and over again now. So the why behind continuous ATO is continuous ATO enables continuous delivery, and continuous delivery reduces risk. I feel like I need a prove me wrong sign on that one. Change my mind.
I think that's very apropos, but I also think we need to, I've learned in my communications, right? I say it, speed with discipline now, because we want you running with scissors, but we'd really recommend you don't have the pointy end of the scissors in front of your eye when you're running, maybe point it the other way. So you have to invest in foundations to get agility and speed in anything you do. Right? If you build a building and you don't put the footers in the ground so deep, you can build really fast, floors 10 through 20. It's not going to matter. The thing's going to fall down in the first windstorm, right? So the notion I don't have to invest, the notion that I don't have to have a solid foundation, to me, is preventing the agility we want. If we do that investment and we recognize that's not difficult, it's a cost trade, right? And once you get that investment point, you can really increase your agility and speed quickly. But I'll tell you, I've noticed a pattern taking names out of it. 17 CATOs that we've executed in the last couple of years in my boundaries. And the same phenomenology is happening on all of them. And this is a hard topic to bring up. It's taking 2 or 3 years of that investment to get to a point where someone has the things in place necessary to say we really have reached cATO. And it takes less than a year for it to atrophy and destroy itself. And I think that is a challenge we have in our expectations, right? it grows fast. We get there, people get burnt out. We burned poor Angela out, so she had to go work somewhere else, right? You had to leave, Brian. I mean, we have a small group. They're high performing, they're focused, they're working 23 hours a day, right? If their commander's a good guy, gives them an hour off. They're working really hard. They get there. We didn't document, we didn't train, we didn't build the ecosystem around it appropriately enough. We didn't make it sustainable, right? And then we do in the government something else. We pull your funding. We don't keep you funded for that sustainment. We tell you to do 7 more things and not the 3 things we started off doing. We create logos and T-shirts and artwork, and we start to, become a little bit off track. That is not a knock, but that is an observation that is consistent across every single one I've seen. I can't speak for the Army, but Angela, I've had this conversation with Nancy in the past, right? In terms of how do we get after understanding why that is? And then how do we go back into our ecosystem and build in the guardrails to prevent that? Because that to me is going to destroy more than anything else what we want to go do. Over.
I think one point that you hit on there is like laying the proper foundation to be able to build that building, right? And I think that that's where the Army Software Factory is. Like, and yes, we 100% have our struggles, but we are building that foundation so that we can have applications be able to do exactly what they need to do on a grand scale. And I think a lot of that has to go with like the folks that are over at the Army Software Factory. That we've got a lot of amazing talent there that has lessons learned from other places. We have a bunch of previous Kessel runners, so that helps in being able to be like, hey, remember that thing we had and that really big pain point? Let's not do that here, and we can do it the right way. But one area that like I think was highlighted right across this that we don't have in the government is, and someone asked this question in the chat a little while ago, what do ISMs do, or what do people that are trying to do this, like what do they do? Who do they go to? How do they get those lessons learned? I know recently we've started like a bunch of teams have gotten together, Space Camp, Bespin, Platform One, Kessel Run, the Army Software Factory, and we're sharing lessons learned like internally. And one thing that I've wanted to do from that is having like a one-on-one, like 101, like how do you do DevSecOps, and how is the Army doing DevSecOps, and how is the Army Software Factory very particular doing it, and what is the groundwork that we're laying in? Because when I think you see that, you're going to see we do controls, we're answering our controls, we're documenting our controls, and we've learned that from previous lessons from Kessel Run, like, hey, we have to do this, because otherwise, if you don't build towards automation, or you don't build to have someone else step right in your spot, then when people go, you lose that continuity. Yeah, it's tough. It's great to see a lot of Kessel runners in the chat. Great to see a lot of people in the DevSecOps ecosystem in the chat. I love it. I'm seeing a lot of very familiar names.
Well, maybe I can spin off that a bit, and we can start talking about, because I know what we've tried to frame this conversation around is really how to get started working towards cATO and what that could mean for you or your organization. So maybe the next best question is building off of all this. We've talked about lessons learned and what we've seen and where the shift is and all of that, but how does someone get started? And maybe, there's been lots of conversations around the DoD memo as well. And I know that folks want to hit on that. And I think there's lots of great conversations where people tear the memo apart and build it back up again and hit it every which way. So there's tons of conversations around that specifically, but maybe we could focus on maybe what does the memo change about getting started? Not what does the memo mean, or is it wrong, or should we change it, or anything like that. But what do we need to think about when it comes to getting started working towards the cATO, and does the DoD CISO memo change the way that we think about getting started, or give us a common language for how to do that?
So if I can start, I think the first thing you need to do is you need to get a good group of people that you can bounce ideas off of and that will tell you when you're wrong. So align yourself with people that want to go do something really awesome and cool and help change and shape the DoD, and make sure that you're comfortable being able to say no to each other. So having that good, psychological safety, making sure you can deliver positive feedback to people, and being able to say, am I off the rails? Can my people around me tell me if I'm off the rails or not off the rails? So have a good group. You want to get started. If you're in an existing program, present all of the work that Kessel Run has done, point that to the LinkedIn, go to enablement days, get your program manager on board or your product manager, get your designer involved, start talking internally to your team to say, I want to make this shift for us so we can go after that cATO. Because if you try to go do it alone and you're with your team, like you're never going to get there. So like you've got to get almost everyone. You can probably drag that last person along with you. Like you can probably convince them along the ride. You might have to pull them a little bit. We've all had to do that with a team member until they get there, but get on board. Talk with your the people that have been in the government for 20 years. What did they do that was innovative back in their day, right? What did they do? What challenges did they face? Because I guarantee you it's going to be a similar problem that you're going to hear. We face bureaucracy. You hear that 20 years ago from the folks that worked this, that started doing RMF, or when DIACAP was there, you were fighting bureaucracy. So you've got to align yourself with good people and then hear what challenges and how they worked around challenges. So educate yourself on how to navigate those waters. And that you're going to get from all of the legacy traditional folks, because they've been there, they've done that. They've already done this before you've done it, and they're probably in just maintain and feed in their system. And so now you're like, okay, we've gone to enablement day. We've learned about Kessel Run. We've learned about Bespin. We've learned about Platform One. Reach out and contact all those folks. Get time with someone. See if someone will talk to you. I'm sure most of them will talk to you in some way, shape, or form, or help you with lessons learned and hear out how you can do things. And then, yes, then you have to go to the guidance of the memo. But before you even get to wanting to achieve that memo and that outcome, it's a team sport, just like was said earlier. You've got to get everyone on your team on board to want to change the way you're currently doing business, to shifting that paradigm into all rowing in the same direction. Because you can say as a team, we're going to go get a cATO. If you are not all on board and you are not comfortable of being in an uncomfortable space with each other, your program manager, if you're doing waterfall, your PM is the one that's really in charge of everything. If you have to listen to that PM and end of story. You've got to bring that person back in line with everyone, have a really good balanced team together, that your designer has just as much of an equal say as your security engineer, as your platform engineer or your developer. You all have to be able to have an equal say. When you have that good core together, then start to go look at the cATO. And if you don't, so what happens if you don't? I come across that question the most. What happens when the people I work with do not believe in what I do? You can continue to try to fight it from within, or maybe you go look for a place that you can align yourself to do those modernizations. And so that's a really scary thing to say to people, go find a new job. It's not really what I'm saying. See within your programs, go talk to your command, say, I'm passionate about this new innovative stuff that's going on in the government. How do I get more involved? And maybe you do need to realign yourself into an area where you can help push that forward. So from my perspective, go talk to all the people that you used to talk to that have been around for years, see how they hacked the bureaucracy 20 years ago, because they probably still have a great idea of how to do it. And then, so let me kick it over to Lonnie to talk about what to actually do to get the cATO.
Thank you. And I feel like that was right on point. I would have started with the people. It's so important, but you highlighted one thing that I think is very important, that many people in this space and DevSecOps, they do not want to deal with the folks that have been doing legacy because it's taking them slower to adopt. It's taking them a longer time to understand. But the benefits that you have when you can balance your team with the folks that have done legacy, that's going to understand how to navigate the bureaucracy, that's going to understand the policy, how to get you through certain things, I think is so important. I want to also reiterate, even aligning yourself with a supportive team as well as leadership staff, and I think I saw the benefit of that even supporting Danny within his environment, because that is one of the AO boundaries for the Air Force that's very innovative. So it gives me the opportunity a lot to develop and stretch and develop strategies and think innovatively where other boundaries are not necessarily allowing their teams to do that. So I think that's also very important. So as far as the cATO memo, I think, I may be one of few, but I really like the memo. I think that this was a great first attempt from DOD to get us grounded, to get us all at least to start talking about this is the foundation of what we're looking for. I also think that it struck a balance, a really good balance of being prescriptive, but enough space to allow you to come back to DOD or your leadership and say how you will implement this. So I think that part of the memo, I actually thought it was very well written for version 1. And I think what we have to understand, especially in DOD, there's not like this one person in DOD goes sits in a vault and write a memo. It doesn't work that way. There's a lot of collaboration. And I guarantee you, once we start submitting these authorizations to DOD, that's going to influence the memo even more. They're looking to do the right thing. We're not looking to put bureaucracy on there, but there's certain statutory requirements and things that they have to meet. So I do think that I like that the way that DOD is stretching. Even the way DOD has done, the way we did the reference architecture guides. Typically in the past, we have this one huge guide that takes 4 years to update. And I like the way they did the reference design document and would say, okay, I have a strategy that's going to baseline you. So this goes back to where you should start. This is another area that you can start. Start with research, start with learning, start with understanding. And I think the DOD reference design documents will be very helpful from that perspective. And the way that they broke it out is beneficial for your novice into your more experienced. You can look at the strategy to understand different, just to baseline you on taxonomy. What is DevSecOps, the strategy? Then you start getting into your fundamentals. That's where you're going to get your guidebooks. You're going to get more specific. Then you get even more specific down to your reference design, where you talk about more technical, very deep technical topics like your Kubernetes and AWS managed service. So I think there's a lot there. They have a tools and activity checklist within a reference design. And if you look at that, it really lays out, and I think they did a really good job of saying, as your MVP, what are things you need to look at? And that means even from a people process perspective, how do we onboard our people? So not just about let me hire the right people. How do we onboard them? How do your people communicate? What's your communication methodology? If some programs we went into and the developers like, hey, the whole RMF package is in GitHub, and the cyber people are like, well, what do you mean? How do I get to that? What is that? How do I translate that? So it goes to understanding the culture. How will you submit these documentation, onboarding them? And then when we talk about innovation, you also have to, again, going back again to team sport, and I think I may have stolen that term from Danny a while back, but that is the most important part of starting to get to a CTO and managing a CATO. And I will also offer, don't just step out the gate trying to get a CATO. Why? Because it's the new phrase, it's the new terminology. No, you working on getting the authorization. And there's a lot of things you have to do that. Build your infrastructure. Think about, like you said, your teams. What are, your pipelines? Build your system. People are asking to get CATOs that don't truly understand just the foundational RMF, that doesn't understand foundationally the technology or what we're trying to do. But I think it's that term, that new shiny thing that people want to get to. I am a fan, and I really truly believe that you should have a day one authorization first before you can even think to get to a CATO. You need to be looking at an exhaustive process using RMF, day one authorization, and your maturity level, which is going to take years, should be CATO. And I also think a lot of people put energy with building the CATO, or when they're starting that initial take of the infrastructure. And you get like you said, a lot of smart, innovative people. They're excited. And guess what? They go out to do other new, exciting things once they have it built. So the issue is not only getting a CATO, is we're having a problem maintaining the environment. You can't, and I think with that goes a lot to do. I want to go back to acquisitions again too. Even from DOD, they have to look at the workforce. You have to look. It's so competitive out here for the workforce, even with the government workforce, that you need to lead the folks, right? We need to have the right government leadership in these environments. We have to look at their pay structure. We have to look at, when we're bringing folks on contract, let's not go butts and seats. Let's look at be outcome based. So I think we have to get innovative from an acquisition standpoint. So another thing I think you should do as you're looking at building this, you need to be talking to your acquisition team. So it's not only the team that's working the technology. You have to understand. You have to put an acquisition strategy in there to build as well as to maintain and to build these dashboards that they want us to see. That's money implications there, right? The continuous monitoring that we're growing to, that persistent continuous monitoring. So I think, number one, building the right team, I agree. Understanding the acquisition strategy, coming up with a strategy for what you want to do, and then focus really on building a secure environment, not necessarily what type of authorization that you get.
Yeah, and one thing that I really want to add there is there's the acquisition strategy. There's also a technical strategy. People in process been covered, so I'm going to kind of stay away from that for a second. But like we said, the whole goal here is to ship outcomes to prod. I'm talking about apps and data solutions primarily. And the only way you can do that is if you have a platform in prod, and that platform provides you controls that you can inherit so that you can go a lot faster. And so the first step really is evaluating the landscape of what platforms are available to me at what levels, classification levels primarily. And don't believe what you're reading on LinkedIn. There is just like so much. I'm not going to call anybody out, but there's a lot of misinformation going on about like, oh, we have 30 apps in prod. And then you look under the hood and it's like they call their environment prod, but it's not really prod. It doesn't actually have an ATO. It has an IATT. And it's available on IL4, but not IL6. That's just in the roadmap. So just be really careful. And then I would say, that platform also has to have a lot of services. Platforms are not ubiquitous. Pipelines are not ubiquitous. If you've got a certain set of tech stack languages that you're using in your applications, their pipelines might not work for you. Their platform in general might not work for you. So there's just a lot to consider. And then you might end up having to build one. And I would say as much as you can, try to find people who've already mapped controls for common components that you want to use, so that you can save yourself time on what Lanye mentioned, which is that initial authorization. I will say I'm like a lot more aggressive in that, I feel like if you go in with the right people, like, Angel did this on the government side, like us as contractors, I feel very confident about being able to go in and get a continuous ATO, a real one that's like got rigor and discipline behind it, set up in less than a year. I think with the right crew, you could even do it in 6 months. And we've seen that. But I agree, by and large, for most people, unless you have a very select group of folks or the right contractor, which there aren't many, you should plan on getting an initial authorization and this being like a 2 to 3 year journey. And then a couple other things that I'll just throw out there is, make sure that if you do choose a platform from somebody else, they can give you that shared responsibility or control matrix. Be kind and have empathy. Oh man, there's been just be careful here. There has been a lot of, especially like vocal on LinkedIn and other platforms, just like really trashing people who you might say are the frozen middle or frustrating bureaucrats or whatever. And that might feel good, but it's not good. It doesn't do good. It sets us all back. And so I would just say, no matter who it is, be very people focused and don't, worship at the altar of complaints, no matter how good it feels. And then on the memo, I'll say, if I'm gonna look at it in the best possible light. This is hard for me because tend to be a very negative, critical person. But on the best possible light, if I put aside, I think like the organizational psychology aspect of it and some of those barriers that it creates, I think it makes it very clear that you have to do RMF. And I love that. And I think that was an important step for somebody to take. And I think even a first step before more people go get one is cleaning up some of the ones we already have. And then I think it also makes it clear, Danny mentioned how people get them and then they just, 12 months they've decayed. It makes the Kanban piece, which is not a new requirement, but it puts it very front and center with some language that I really like, so that you can't get your continuous ATO. And people actually know this, by the way. It's not happenstance, Danny, that they know that they can get it and that nobody's going to do anything afterwards. And it's not that they want to subvert security or anything like that. It's that they have limited resources. And if I have 20 FTE and I've got 5 people dedicated to this, and now I've got a customer screaming for more app features, what do you think that I do, right? I reallocate those resources. So this is an Air Force resourcing problem. We should, start making those programs that are failing struggle for their existence rather than all these innovative ones. That's another podcast, but I would say make sure that you have, back to Lanier's point, I'll just double down on, make sure you have a really good acquisition strategy for how you're going to resource this thing going forward, because the requirements is now clear that you can't get away with letting your continuous ATO decay.
Danny, I'll pass you the mic on what you think about next steps here. Sorry, go ahead.
So I would offer the next steps, right? I enjoyed, the conversation with Lanier, with Angel, with you, Brian, and Shane, and some of the chat questions. Instead of summarizing what I think, what I'd like to offer is, how do we set up a structure for a continued dialogue, right? Is that through you, Shane? Is that through Rise? I would love to form a coalition of the willing roundtable. There was some great questions in the chat we didn't have time to get to. I find that to be the most stimulating, productive way for us to collaborate towards a future and communicate. So I'm in, if we want to figure out how to do that and answer some of those questions and address some of those and have some kind of follow-on activity. And again, thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I'll say is that we are planning to have a second one of these to talk about how we fight against that atrophy and decay. Like I said at the top, that defense against the dark arts. So that is a small down payment on the thing that you're talking about. But Brian, I don't know if you want to talk about that bigger piece.
Yeah, I'll throw it to the audience and also the speakers to, hit us up after the event if you have ideas on how to do that. There's some good existing avenues. I'm partial to JSoft because I've been active in it, but there's probably other forums that we could use. Otherwise, we'd be happy to do it as well. But if you have ideas on creating kind of a community of practice around this, we'd love to hear them.
Awesome. I know we're coming up right against the bottom of the hour here. My one reminder as MC is we shared at the beginning, there's a form that you can fill out if you want to join the Rise 8 conference, the Prod Academy happening in September. So make sure to fill it out, get in the list, learn about what's happening before everybody else does. It's right there at the bottom of your screen as well. If you dial that number, we'll be able to connect you to what you need. But we got a couple minutes here just for closing thoughts. I'll go around like we did. I'll actually go clockwise. I know I got the order confused there. If you guys have a last thing you want to hit on, anything that you want to plug that you're working on, anything like that, we'll just go around the horn. And again, thank you all. So Danny, over to you first.
So the CATO in the memo has really come up. We are working with them. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. Right. I used to get in trouble. Lanier's heard this before. In 8th grade, I got thrown out of my English class a lot because the teacher would go and say, "Did you read that book? And this is what the author intended." And I'd say, "How do you know the author's dead? You never met them." I think in my collaborations with DoD CIO, my seeking to understand, I've learned a lot about what their intent behind that memo was. And it's not being interpreted correctly because English language is the worst language on the planet for communicating effectively in. So I think there is more to come on that, and I hope to share some of that with you all as we come down the road. But it is a very open, collaborative, I think productive discussion with DoD CIO. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Danny. Angel, over to you.
So I can say anything. Ooh, this is dangerous. All right. The Army Software Factory is amazing. If you haven't checked it out and see what we're doing over there, please go take a look. We are enabling our soldiers to be designers, PMs, developers. They go through a tech accelerator. They have to pass rigorous tests. We are literally changing the workforce from the soldier perspective. We're not adding, we have contractors. Shout out to all of our contractors. We couldn't do a lot of this work without you and your support. We have military, we have civilians. It's a great mix. But really how we are enabling our soldiers is absolutely amazing. So if you haven't checked us out, go check us out. We have some fantastic apps in prod. When we say we have an app in prod, we do actually have an app in prod. So Kroger was not speaking about the Army Software Factory in that aspect. And anyone who wants to learn what the Army Software Factory is doing, engage with us on LinkedIn. Hit us up. Happy to talk. And if you are a vendor and you see me after and you're like, hey, I've got this great solution to sell you, great. Send me your controls. Send me your documentation. Because sending me a link to your website that just has fancy infographics, like, cool. Show me the actual artifacts and send me things. So thanks.
Thanks, Angel. Brian, over to you, man.
I love that. I will vouch for. I got to see Army Software Factory firsthand a bit ago, and it's incredible what they're doing. To me, having seen inside all the software factories or the main ones, they're kind of the model going forward. And I think it'll keep growing. We'll keep iterating, but like right now, to me, that's kind of the standard. So definitely check that out. And I just want to say thank you to all of our guests. Danny, it's been a pleasure. It's been too long since we got to chat, and I'm glad that we kind of came full circle here. Angel and Lanya, y'all are both awesome. Angel, Lanya, over to you.
Thank you. So first, I would say that as far as I've been on a couple of these podcasts, and I think that the folks that you chose were great as far as diversity, because here we have at the leadership, implementers, and then also, you know, the one that's doing the policy and risk management portion of that. So I think this was very fruitful. I hope it was fruitful for the audience, and I agree. Hopefully we can have some follow-on sessions. And I will say, just in general, when we going back again to this team sport, like we have to, even when we're talking DOD, that's us. You know, the Army is a part of the DOD, the Air Force is a part of the DOD. That is us. We are writing those policies. We influence those policies. So I think as we have to keep the mind frame as just really, again, team sport, work together. A lot of what the Air Force is doing, I think the Air Force really led the way when it comes to software factory. And so they have a lot of lessons learned. And I think now we're on our second or third iteration. And so I think that makes us, you know, very powerful as far as next steps. And so I'm really excited to where we're going from from the CATO perspective. And then for the programs that's out there, I know we have focused, you know, so much on decentralizing our training, our people, our policy. But I think because the way the workforce is going, and it's very tight and competitive, we really have to look at how do we start centralizing some of our workforce expertise. So I think that's the area that we truly need to focus on, as well as acquisitions. But thank you for having me. This was great.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate all of y'all participating today. We are at time. I do appreciate everybody who was on leaving comments. We were reading questions and comments the whole time. It helped us steer the way we're having the conversation. I hope you guys come to the next one of these. Again, thank you to all our awesome guests. Appreciate it. Thank you all.